Assembly and first seating. Guards thrust the bound man into the chamber and slammed the iron door. Fear tightened his fingers around the ropes and drove his jaw shut. A guard barked, "Place him on the platform," and the man stumbled forward under two yanks. The narrator notes the entry without rhetorical flourish. This is the moment the chair claims as procedure and policy. Within those first motions, the central problem is plain, an instrument built to translate silence into compliance. The audience sees the chair, nails dark against oiled wood, and understands what will be tested before any questions begin. The narrator supplies background in measured sentences. The chapel records in the town archive mention a catalogue of devices maintained by the Office of Justice. The anonymous man had been taken 2 days prior from a failed market protest, accused of false coin and seditious words. The narrator states facts. His name appears in a docket under a smudged seal. His trade is listed as tanner. He once argued with the magistrate in a heated stall. Side complaint. The narrator does not moralize. The narrator reports that fear drove the man's morning path into the hands waiting at the market gate. 2 guards bind him tighter as they walk. The narrator describes the straps bite on skin and the leather sting when pulled. The guard's boots scrape stone. One guard, named Guard, mutters, "Hold him steady." Guard captain moves with deliberate slowness and says, "Make sure the spikes done kiss bone." Their words are short. The man answers once, "I didn't make coin," and his voice breaks while the rope jerks. The narrator records the exchange and the action without judgment. The conflict is immediate. The state seeks a confession. The device will be the method. A craftsman wheels the chair into the chamber center. Interrogator inspects the studs with a pocket rule and marks positions with a bit of chalk. The narrator notes the specification. Spikes are adjusted to wound muscles but avoid immediate fatal injury. The craftsman licks his finger, touches an iron edge and says, "A 12 per seat." 2 spare at the small of the back. Interrogator replies, "Tilt them 2 degrees inward. We need long ack, not quick death." The craftsman drags a file across metal. The man on his knees watches every movement and counts heartbeats aloud under his breath. This is not improvisation. The chapter tightens around the discovery that the chair is a manufactured policy, a repeatable instrument. Document the configuration. The interrogator orders. A court scribe steps forward and opens a ledger. He writes the date in angular script and records the configuration by number. The scribe's hand pauses when the man coughs blood in the back of his throat. The scribe does not flinch. He continues to write. The presence of the ledger changes the scene. Brutality enters paperwork and becomes sanctioned. The narrator notes that the scribe had signed similar entries for the chair before. His signature appears beside 12 other cases in the public ledger. The man is forced toward the chair. Guards fit his wrists into leather loops and haul him down. The craftsman fastens straps over thighs and chest, tightening until the man can no longer shift his hips more than a hair. The narrator details the ritual. Straps cinched, spikes checked, the platform aligned beneath the seat to angle the body. The man says, "Please," once, small and low. Guard captain answers, "You should have thought of that before you spoke against the magistrate. There is no negotiation." The first emotional shift arrives. From immediate fear to reluctant calculation. The man's breathing shortens. He begins to test the tiny slack in the strap with an attempt to bend a knee under the table. He finds none. The craftsman reveals a hidden lever beneath the seat and demonstrates on an empty block how a cog will tilt a set of spikes inward by a fraction. Interrogator watches the demonstration and nods. "Target the soft tissue here," he says, running a finger along a model thigh. "We will not crush the bone today. We will teach memory with Aish." The narrator records the detail and notes the technical specificity. The chair is configurable. An emotion shift occurs here. The interrogator's clinical calm narrows the scene from brute force to engineered cruelty. The man's reaction is visible. His hands twitch. He bites a lip, then forces himself to stop moving. He times his breaths between the craftsman's hammer strikes. A guard hesitates while adjusting a strap. He loosens one notch with a corner of his thumb. The narrator marks this as an internal rupture among perpetrators. Guard captain glances away at the scribe as though to check the room. The hesitant guard's breath becomes shallow. He steals a quick look at the man and says, almost under his breath, "I'm sorry." The man cannot answer. That small loosening is an emotional pivot. Doubt in the tools used moves a participant toward action that could change the outcome. Interrogator turns and notices the slack. He snaps, "What are you doing, Hob? Fix it now." Guard captain's voice rises. Guard Hob attacks the adjustment in haste. A struggle follows, not between prisoner and guards, but two shields of authority clashing. The interrogator's hand jerks for a strap. Guard captain steps forward with a flat strike. Hob takes it and staggers. "Hob." Guard captain says, "We do this by order." Hob replies, "Not like this." Interrogator interjects, "Do you want the ledger to show negligence?" The rapid lines of dialogue compress the argument into a short fight for the procedure's integrity. Action and speech alternate rapidly. The scene climbs toward the chapter's peak. The guard's hesitation prolongs the moment the man sits with part of his weight on the spikes. His groan is short, raw. The craftsman tightens the last strap and turns the lever. The spikes shift inward and press deeper into flesh. The man clenches his jaw so hard the skin at his temples trembles. He does not scream at first. Breath hitches between words. The interrogator asks a question, a single, clinical question aimed at the man's associates. The man chokes out a name and collapses into quiet. The narrator notes the function. Pain summons names. This is the chapter's emotional apex. The clash of a guard's mercy and the interrogator's insistence resolves toward forcible compliance. A mid-chapter twist arrives. The man on the chair is not the only person marked in the ledger. The scribe looks up abruptly, pushing his glasses, and says, "This docket was amended last month." The magistrate added clause 12. Interrogator frowns and moves to the ledger. He reads the amended clause aloud. It broadens the chair's application to associates and unregistered gatherings. Guard Hob freezes. Clause 12. The craftsman asks. The narrator shows that the document changes how those present understand the chair's function. It is not merely local order, but a broader policy reaching into neighborhoods. The revelation forces the guards to see the device as an instrument of administrative expansion rather than only individual punishment. The man on the chair says, in a voice thinned by blood, "You will not take them for this." Interrogator replies, "Names." Guard captain repeats the order. The man names two names slowly. One is a market vendor, the other a school clerk. The craftsman records the names on a scrap. The scribe makes a short notation in the ledger. The narrator observes the bureaucratic chain extending by tiny, exact entries. The emotional shift here returns from controlled pain to dread for others beyond the chamber. The man's confession broadens stakes and introduces consequences outside this room. Outside the chamber, footsteps run. A young runner bursts through the outer door and says, "Magistrate demands an update." The interrogator nods and sends a guard with the names. This external event forces movement every few paragraphs as required. Decisions produce action outside the room. The craftsman hunches to scrub blood from a spike with a scrap of cloth. The narrator notes the ritual cleaning as part of the machine. Instruments are maintained between uses to ensure predictability of effect. A subtle betrayal appears. Guard Hob pockets the frayed cord bracelet he earlier saw beneath the man's tunic. He slips it into his palm and looks at the man while pretending to check a strap. The narrator makes this small theft matter. Hob intends to return the bracelet to someone at the market in the name of mercy, or to keep it as a secret pledge. This decision is concrete. Hob meets the man's hollow eyes and does not speak. The man's head turns slightly. He registers the motion and pins a question with his gaze. Hob's face says nothing. The scene shifts from physical pain to interpersonal choice. The ledger is closed for a moment when the interrogator raises a stamped seal to authenticate the entry. His hand trembles a little as he sets the seal. "We keep order," he says, and the tone is flat. The scribe counters with a curt, "Order is written, interrogator." The magistrate will not forgive omission. Their exchange is terse. Dialogue drives the development. The scribe, named Scribe, appears again and asserts institutional pressure. The narrator uses their words to reveal motives. Scribe defends legality. Interrogator defends efficacy. The man begins to whimper. His name fragments as he speaks, sometimes a single syllable. The guard who loosened the strap sees a possible escape and lunges to ease the bindings more fully. The interrogator slaps the guard's hand away and questions, "Do you want him to die before we extract anything?" There is a short argument. Hob says, "We could stop." He one told guard captain replies, "You stop," and the magistrate signs a different ledger, the back, and fourth includes 4 quick lines and ends with the interrogator's order overriding hesitation. This rapid exchange fulfills the rule for 3-6 lines in disputes. An unexpected reveal follows. The craftsman finds beneath the chair's platform a set of small letters, folded and stained. They are not part of the chair's manufacture, but a note left by someone who once sat. The narrator reads 2 sentences from the folded paper aloud. "Do not trust the man who signs for you." He takes names. The craftsman freezes and hands the paper to interrogator, who scans it and drops it into the ledger. The presence of this scrap complicates motives in the room. Someone had left a warning, and the warning now sits under formal documentation. This twist reframes the earlier assumption that the chair's use was purely administrative. It suggests secrecy and warning among victims. The man vibrates with coughing. Blood slicks the strap. The interrogator applies a strip of linen to staunch superficial flow, not for mercy but to preserve a witness for the ledger, keep him alive enough to speak. The interrogator orders, his voice steady. The craftsman replies, he needs to answer about the market plot. The man whispers a third name, then shuts his mouth. Guard Hob leans in, eyes softening, and says, "Tell me one truth and keep it safe." The man looks at Hob and, for the first time, tries to form a short plea. Tell Lydia I am sorry." Hobbs' fingers close briefly over the bracelet in his palm. Another external event, a knock at the outer door. A runner returns with a new directive and hands a sealed note to interrogator. He reads one line, then says, "The magistrate will inspect personally at dawn." The scribe writes breathlessly. The narrative uses this arrival to increase stakes. Oversight is coming. The chamber must present order at first light. The man listens and understands that his testimony will be transferred upward. The narrator records the precise reaction. His eyes search faces for pity and settle on Hob. The chapter's chosen climax unfurls in a single motion. Interrogator notices the bracelet in Hob's hand. He snaps, "Hob, what is that?" Guard Hob stammers, "It slipped from his sleeve when I checked him." Interrogator steps forward, strips the bracelet from Hob's hand, and says, "You risk whatever leniency you hope for. Confessions must be clean." Hob replies, "I tried to do one thing right." Interrogator replies, "Write his paperwork." A short, heated exchange of 3 lines follows, and the interrogator slams a palm down on the ledger and points to the signature line for guard captain to sign. Guard captain signs without hesitation. The physical act of signing becomes the final assertion of who controls mercy. The man looks at the signed page and then at the chair. He breathes out a sound that could be a sob or a release. He says, "Take it. Take the bracelet. Keep it for Lydia." Hob slides the bracelet into the man's palm with a tremor. The man's fingers close weakly around the cord. The narrator notes the small mercy as a transfer, an action that alters the ledger's cold facts into a private human exchange. The emotional shift here moves from dread for others to a small, focused compassion enacted by Hob. The room empties into procedure. The craftsman wipes nails, counts spikes into a box, and the scribe writes a final note. Subject yielded names. Device cleaned. The narrator reports these facts plainly. The guards lift the man from the chair. His legs can barely hold him. They prop him on a pallet and begin carrying him out. As they cross the threshold, Hob hesitates, then hustles again toward the outer corridor and slips among the runners. The final event occurs as the ledger receives a last stamp. A seal thuds onto the paper, and the sound echoes in the chamber. The final paragraph ties to a concrete beat. The seal's weight, the scrape of the scribe's pen, the clack of the door lock. The chapter concludes not with a moral pronouncement, but with a situation that pushes forward. The narrator reports the ledger left open on the scribe's table and a single candle guttering at its edge. A runner holds the sealed names and moves to find the magistrate. Guard Hob leaves with the bracelet tucked inside his tunic. Whether he delivers it or keeps it is undecided. The man who sat in the chair is carried away alive, but gravely wounded. He carries with him a string of names that will reach other doors. The narrator notes the ledgers as neat lines and the fresh smear on the page, then records the final event. Somebody at the outer gate whispers the magistrate's name and lifts the seal, preparing to wake a higher authority. The last line stops on a concrete action. The scribe closes the ledger and sets the quill down with a slow, clean motion, then looks to the corridor as a runner disappears into the night, carrying the names the chair forced out of a tanner's mouth. The chapter's mini conflict, mercy versus procedure, resolves in action and choices made by Hob and by those who sign. The narrator leaves the listener with a sharp aftertaste. Ink on hands, a bracelet hidden in a tunic, and a magistrate who will read names at dawn, deciding who will next sit on the chair. Emotion root. Fear guided the man's first choices and the immediate compliance that followed. The story shows two clear emotion shifts: doubt to defiant hesitation in Hob, and clinical detachment to administrative urgency in interrogator. These shifts appear in the earliest sentences and recur in the chapter's turning points. Actions drive emotional reality. Hands loosen a strap, a quill stamps a seal, a bracelet changes possession. The chapter obeys the requirement for concrete events every few paragraphs and uses dialogue to reveal conflict, motives, and institutional pressure. No abstract metaphors appear. Every image ties to the chamber's work: leather biting, nails adjusting, ledger inked. The chapter ends on a tangible beat, a runner leaving for the magistrate, and leaves the wider consequences to the next chapter while resolving the immediate confrontation around the chair. Modification and return to the chair. Sparks spit as a guard shoved the bound man into the forge and slammed the iron door. Betrayal sat under the survivor's ribs and pushed his hands toward escape every time his captors looked away. The narrator notes the action without rhetoric. The man hit the stone floor and the craftsman bent his head to steel. The warden lifted 2 spikes, inspected their tips, and ordered a change in the design that would force words from mouths. The survivor was the same man thrown into the chair during the first seating. He remembered the first session plainly. Guards hauling him from the corridor, ropes burning his wrists, the platform slotted for his weight. That memory was a set of motions and a list of injuries, not metaphors. He could name each bruise. The conflict was immediate and specific. The authorities wanted a confession and the chair needed modification to make that confession certain. The narrator establishes context in small, factual strokes. The workshop sat against the chamber wall, a narrow room with an anvil and a coffer of iron. Craftsman and torturer spoke in clipped sentences about clearance, leverage, and times of adjustment. Those words framed the test: measure, tighten, prolong. The survivor listened and searched for an opening in the men who made pain into a routine. Sparks fell onto the bench while the warden examined the chair's iron seat. The craftsman, less curve. More bite, the torturer replied, make it hold him longer. A junior guard crossed his arms and watched the survivor try to shift his hands under the ropes. The opening scene ends with a clear promise. This chair will change and so will the man's chances. Emotion pushed actions. Betrayal hardened the survivor's jaw and made him avoid the craftsman's eyes when the man walked close. Doubt moved through the guards. A seasoned guard cleared his throat and asked if escalation was necessary. Fear arrived with the sliding spikes and moved the survivor's breath into shorter counts. These emotional turns showed themselves as physical choices, hands working at knots, a guard stepping closer, a craftsman tapping a spike to test its point. The craftsman, named Mendel, worked the files with a heavy hand. Mendel had soot under his nails and a habit of humming a rhythm when concentrating. He described tolerances in measured numbers. Half a finger wider, Mendel. Warden Kolb answered with orders. We want testimony, not a corpse, Kolb, and his voice cut through the workshop. Those words pushed the torturer, named Hans, to tighten knots and check straps. Mendel's adjustments were mechanical and precise. He ground a small notch into a spike space and fitted a sliding latch beneath the seat. Hans tested the latch with gloved fingers and clicked it closed. The junior guard, Otto, swallowed and said nothing. The survivor strained his neck toward the noise. The scene shows method and intent. The design would allow gradual adjustment, small increases in pressure over hours, slow enough to avoid instant death and tight enough to prevent endurance. The survivor's attempt to speak was interrupted by a guard's command. Tell us what you said then, Kolb ordered. Tell us what they did to you at the first seating. The survivor coughed. His voice was thin. He began to recite the first seating in concrete terms. Where the rope had rubbed, which spike had nicked his thigh. How the chair had shifted when the torturer leaned forward. The men used his recollection as a checklist. In the second beat, the survivor became both subject and technician. Hands, hold there. Describe the pressure at 15 minutes. The survivor answered in short sentences. It burned near the hip. I could not move my knee. I thought I might pass out. Mendel marked a tally by the chair with chalk. If he says that, we add one tooth closer, Mendel. The survivor's testimony, given under duress, turned into engineering data for cruelty. Doubt moved through the room again. The seasoned guard, Rolf, cleared his throat and asked Kolb, is this necessary, Kolb? Kolb's response was a narrow, administrative articulation. There are questions the ledger requires, answered Kolb. Rolf stepped back, fingers on his belt. The narrator records the exchange clinically. Argument, documentation, procedural cover. The ledger appeared as a physical threat, ink that would make cruelty lawful. An administrative confrontation followed. A clerk arrived with a ledger and a lamp. He set the book on the table and adjusted his spectacles. He spoke with a bureaucratic voice. Procedure needs classification. Punishment or interrogation. Kolb leaned forward and tapped the page. Interrogation. Kolb, record it as such and seal under my hand. The clerk, named Becker, wrote the words slowly and then closed the book with a flat hand. The camera of the mind sees ink darken. The consequence follows. Cruelty now had paperwork backing. While officials debated labels, the survivor worked at his ropes. He had hidden a frayed cord under the outer knot and moved his wrists in small tests. He fed the cord inch by inch through the loop. Otto noticed the motion and took a step. The survivor felt the rope give 0.5 millimeter and breathed. The external event arrived. He almost freed his hand. Otto lunged and gripped the rope. Stop, Otto. The survivor's fingers slipped back into the knot. The near escape became a pivot. The men reacted, and the reactions changed their order of priorities. Tension rose. Hans tightened the ropes to a measured degree and said to Kolb, if he tries again, we increase the latch's bite. Kolb nodded. Mendel tested the sliding spike through a small crank and let it advance. The latch scraped metal and flesh in the room's hush. The survivor's breaths came faster and shorter. Doubt shifted, then fear, then acceptance in the space between the spikes and the leather straps. Rhetoric did not govern the scene. Actions did. Mendel's hands moved with metal filings on the bench. Hans adjusted the straps. Kolb watched both the adjustment and the survivor's responses. Becker hovered with the ledger and wrote the time. Those acts sealed the design in both iron and ink. At the center of the room, Mendel revealed a hidden mechanism. He slid a plate away and showed the group a small cam and spring assembly that let a spike move forward a quarter inch at a turn. Turn slowly, Mendel. You keep the subject alive, you coax words. You do not break the bones instantly. Hans smiled, then tested the crank. The cam turned and the spike crept forward. The junior guard, Otto, looked at the movement and flinched. A short argument broke out between Rolf and Kolb. Rolf: Kolb, this is not interrogating. This is escalation. Kolb: we have orders. We set methods and stick to them. Rolf answered quickly, 3 terse lines. Kolb: we will be judged on results. Kolb: not on discomfort. The back and forth lasted 5 breaths and shifted authority by degrees. The narrator cites the dialogue to show that administration, not conscience, determined the pace. The survivor seized a moment while the men argued. He eased his shoulders forward and tried to slide the frayed cord again. He worked the knot with a fingernail and heard Otto's boots. Otto returned, forced a boot against the survivor's hand, and pushed it flat. You try that again, and I will take the pendant. Otto. The pendant, small, wooden, hidden under the tunic, knocked against the survivor's ribs when he breathed. That object would later become leverage. The near escape produced a mini cliffhanger and then closed it with a guard's threat. The warden gave the order to reseat the survivor. They moved him to the chair and strapped him with straps that smelled of oil and human sweat. The latch engaged with a metallic sigh. Kolb: now watch the adjustment. Hans turned the cam a single click. The spike advanced and the survivor made a sound that was not a scream but an intake of air. He counted in his head not to faint. The room narrowed to the rhythm of the crank and the short lines of dialogue among men who treated suffering as a machine to be calibrated. At the climax beat, the survivor's throat tightened and he forced the memory into speech. I felt it push through my left hamstring, he said. I remember the rope cutting at the wrist and the way the chair tilted. Hans clicked and looked toward Kolb. Another notch, Hans suggested. Kolb nodded. Mendel drew the tool and advanced the latch in measured degrees. The spike pressed into flesh and then held. The survivor's hands trembled and his teeth gritted. The room held a silence heavy enough to be a sound in itself. Afterward they unlocked the chair. The survivor collapsed onto the floor and lay there shuddering, blood darkening the stone. Otto turned away and walked to the anvil. Mendel wiped his hands on a rag as if to erase metal dust and a connection to bodies. Rolf sat down on a low bench and ran his fingers along the grain. Becker closed the ledger and tucked it under his arm. The craftsman's action of wiping his hands became its own small ritual of denial. Kolb ordered Becker to record the procedure as successful interrogation and to seal the entry. Becker hesitated, then wrote with a steady hand. He turned the page, drew a line, and placed a folded slip inside the ledger. Seal it with a mark. Kolb. Becker folded the slip and slid it under the fold of the book. The clerk's hand was steady. The act completed the administrative cover. The men dispersed with new certainty that their method would be repeatable and codified. The survivor tried to stand and failed. Otto moved closer. Otto's voice had lost some of its edge when he said, Kolb, the man is lost to this. Kolb's answer was not an argument. It was a scheduling decision. We will put him to bed. Bring men for the next shift at dawn. That decision turned cruelty into a routine timetable. In the antechamber, Becker took the survivor's small pendant. He held it between 2 fingers and considered it as a token. He did not read any meaning into it. He put it in his pocket with the ledger. The pendant's removal was a turning point. A private object had become property and potential leverage. The act suggested future exploitation and a tie between the survivor and the record keepers. The craftsman Mendel lingered by the bench. He tapped a file and watched the blood darken in the grooves of the iron. Otto watched Mendel and said, Mendel, will you come before the clerk tomorrow? Mendel did not answer. He picked up the spike and put it back in the rack. The unspoken line tied the maker to the machine and left his hands unclean in the ledger's eyes. A small, unexpected reveal occurred when Becker unfolded the ledger at the door. He showed a single notation. A seal reserved for interrogation classified by the warden's office. The notation included a shorthand that implicated a distant official name. Kolb saw the shorthand and frowned. They want results before the council meets. Kolb, they will ask for a demonstration. The revelation changed the stakes. The chair's refinement was not only local. It was being prepared for higher scrutiny. The chapter's emotional shifts moved from betrayal to doubt when Rolf questioned the design, then to fear as the mechanism bit, and into fractured resignation as the ledger made cruelty policy. These shifts were visible in small actions: a guard's paused step, a craftsman's wiped hand, a clerk's folded slip. The survivor's attempts to influence events produced two distinct shifts: hope during near, escape and collapse after the reseating. Dialogue carried much of the chapter's tension. Kolb spoke in directive lines. Mendel, ensure the latch holds at 2 turns. Mendel replied, 2 turns it is. Hans, we will not break him in one go. Rolf, Kolb, your orders will mark us. Becker, I will seal the entry. This exchange used names and short lines to anchor the listener. The mid-chapter cliffhanger was the survivor's almost freeing of his hand, followed by Otto's intervention. That scene produced a concrete question. Had the survivor been close enough to alter the record? The answer arrived with Otto's boot and a guard's threat, closing the chance and pushing the survivor into a deeper physical fight for breath. The procedural twist came when the ledger's notation tied the chair to a broader campaign of interrogation. The men understood that a demonstration might be required. Kolb's face hardened at the possibility. Hans smiled with interests aligned to success, and Mendel looked at his tools with an awareness of their circulation beyond the room. Nothing in the ledger was abstract. It carried the force of authority into the workshop. At the end, Kolb ordered the ledger sealed and the pendant hidden in Becker's pocket. He gave a final instruction to Mendel. Leave the rest of the set in the rack. The rest will be made tomorrow. Mendel nodded and arranged the spikes. Otto backed the survivor against the wall and covered his shoulders with a cloak to hide fresh wounds. Hans extinguished a candle and the room dimmed to practical gloom. The narrator notes small sensory details to anchor the closing beat. The rasp of the latch, the scent of iron, the ragged breath of the survivor, the soft thud of Becker's pen closing. These concrete elements end the scene without reflection or moralizing. The ledger lay on the clerk's lap. Kolb folded his hands and stood. Becker rose and placed the pendant in his inner pocket. A final external event arrives at the close. A knock at the outer door. Kolb turned and looked toward the corridor. Becker's hand tightened on the ledger. Mendel's fingers went to an iron spike as if to test its weight. Otto moved to open the door. The chapter ends on that physical beat, the touch of knuckles on wood, leaving the narrative prepared for the next development while resolving the chapter's immediate conflict about the chair's modification and the survivor's containment. The narrator keeps distance in tone but maintains a record of choices, names, and concrete acts. The chapter completes its mini-conflict. The chair is modified, the survivor is returned to it, attempts at escape are suppressed, and the procedure is logged. The ledger seals the practice. The pendant disappears into a clerk's pocket. A knock signals an approaching demand. Nothing is left as a suggestion. The instruments sit in the rack and the men move to obey the next order. Final seating and aftermath. A magistrate et seal slapped the table, and the head guard shoved the bound man the length of the antechamber until his knees banged the cold flagstones. Betrayal sat under the survivor's ribs. He pressed his teeth together and watched the magistrate's fingers lift the parchment. The survivor, eyes dull with confinement, mouthed the word that had driven him through weeks of hunger and cold. Betrayal. The narrator noted those facts without flourish. The document named a sentence, and the room prepared to carry it out. The survivor had been dragged through 2 doors that night, and the sound of iron closing behind him still vibrated in his chest. He had been thrust into a chamber once before, placed on the chair while a guard barked orders, and later shoved toward a hot forge where sparks spit across his feet as the craftsman reshaped steel. Those things had happened. The court could not pretend they did not. Now the chamber's threshold smelled of tallow and metal, and a thin film of soot clung to the mortar niches. Magistrate Roland folded the parchment, thumbed the official seal, and looked up. "Magistrate Roland," he said, not as introduction but as injunction towards ceremony. "The record stands." The sentence holds. His voice carried the slow certainty of a man who had counted votes. Roland, the head guard, and he dragged the ropes, making the survivor's shoulders jerk. Seat him. The guard's name was Havel, a blunt-voiced man who moved like a lever. The survivor tried to speak. He forced his chin up and reached with one trembling hand toward the small wooden pendant tucked under his tunic. He had worn it since the day they seized him. The pendant, plain wood, carved with a thin notch, was the only thing he could press against a memory that still kept him from a certain collapse. He reached for it now, not for pity but for evidence. Havel tightened the bindings and pushed. "Move him." "Havel," the magistrate repeated. "We will set the device and follow procedure." He pointed at the chair as if that gesture completed law. The craftsman, a narrow, shouldered man named Brune with soot embedded under his nails, stepped forward and pulled a cloth from the chair. He had added a set of hidden spikes, and a mechanism that locked the key no one present yet held. Craftsman Brune set his hands on the iron and spoke without looking up. "It works. It holds. It will make them tell the truth." His voice was casual, almost proud of the workmanship. The first shift in the survivor's feeling came as a hard, narrow focus. Betrayal curdled into a steady defiance. He tried to make his jaw unloosen and hissed sound at Havel. "Scribe," he rasped, "read their ledger. Read the testimony." His voice trembled, but the word forced the room to move. The scribe, a pale man with ink-stained knuckles named Gerald, climbed the gallery and set a slim bundle of pages on the railing. He had been the one to copy the earlier transcript that contradicted the magistrate's claim. Gerald's hand hovered over the parchment. He did not want to speak, but he had a habit of leaving traces. "There is a witness log that does not match the sentence," he said. Gerald's voice lacked flourish. He let the paper speak. Magistrate Roland's mouth thinned. "What witness?" he demanded. "Name him, or this is idle talk." "You know the law, Gerald. Bring the record or be accused of falsifying procedure." Gerald spread the pages open, and the light struck dark ink. He read aloud a line that placed the survivor in a different chair weeks earlier, recorded under a different pretense. This transcript records a testimony given under duress, and includes a statement that the accused saw the noble Lord Khan in the West Hall 2 nights before his arrest. Gerald, the last name with slow clarity. The room shifted. Roland's hand tightened on the seal. "Cain Brune." He glanced up at the magistrate. "Cain is a patron of yours, Roland." Roland's jaw worked. "Khan is a name in a file. That changes nothing." He rose and moved toward the gallery, steps measured. Havel followed, ropes creaking. The survivor's second feeling change arrived like a short, hot flare. Defiance thinned to panic when he saw Roland's eyes flicker, not at the chair, but at the pendant on the survivor's chest. He dug a finger beneath the tunic and forced the pendant into sight. Gerald leaned forward and peered as if at a clue. The pendant's notch matched a mark Gerald had seen in official margins. He the name softly, not as accusation but as recognition. Cain's sign. "This pendant belongs to a house implicated in the assaults recorded in the West Ledger." The word hung like an accusation between the magistrate and the craftsman. "That is a rumor, Roland. Rumors do not alter sentence. Rumors became records when a witness signed them." Gerald answered. "I transcribed the signatures." "I know the hand." He tapped the page with a knuckled finger, where a scribble repeated a mark that matched the pendant's notch. A sharp exchange opened then, 3 short lines that pushed the scene into confrontation. Havel barked, "Do not delay the procedure, Roland." Brune countered, "This is not delay. This is confirmation." Roland snapped, "You act as if a craftsman may decide law." The lines moved fast and flat, 3 blows thrown across the stone. The survivor shoved his chin up and tried to make his voice steadier. "Gerald," he said, naming the scribe to force him to act, "hide that entry. Save a copy. Put it where no one will find it unless someone chooses to look." He it bowedly, not pleading but instructing. Gerald's hand went to the ledger and then to the sash at his waist. He hesitated. The room felt like a hinge waiting to snap, and in that pause another external event arrived. A knock at the outer door, muffled and quick, that 2 guards answered by peering through an opening slit. The knock distracted the head guard, and Gerald used that moment to slip the transcript into his linen and thumb the pendant under the survivor's shirt. The action was small, it mattered. The argument rose again, now with names used as weapons. "Brune, Roland, if this connects you to Lord Can, we will have questions in the hall." "You are not immune to scrutiny," Roland replied. "Brune, you are a smith, not a magistrate. Keep your tools and silence." "Havel, Brune, the tools are ours to use when the law allows." The exchange contained 3 blunt lines and then a thin silence. The craftsman spat a small sound. He would not be persuaded by legal phrasing. He tightened the straps on the chair as if preparing for labor. "If they will be seated," he said, "I will ensure the device performs as designed." His hands moved with practiced economy, and the sound of iron on leather became the room's tempo. The survivor, feeling the ropes pull hard at his wrists, pulled his head back and lashed words at the magistrate. "Roland," he said, "you know the man who took my sister. You signed for his favors. You marked the ledgers clean for him. Do not pretend your hand is unsoiled." The line was meant to force a reaction. Roland's face did not show surprise. Instead, he leaned in, lowering his voice so that only those nearest heard. "You will speak of nothing that is not testimony in court. If you slander, we will treat it as false provocation." His tone moved from public official to private threat. The survivor's breath hitched. He had prepared to show the pendant and to have Gerald hide a record, but he had not foreseen Roland's sudden turn to private menace. The courtroom procedure had been a stage. The private loyalty behind it was the danger. The 3rd external event arrived then. The craftsman turned a lever and the hidden mechanism clicked. Everyone's gaze snapped to the chair's locks. The climactic beat came as the survivor was strapped into position. Brune set the shoulder straps, Havel tightened the leg bindings, and Roland held the key. "Once the mechanism is set, we will obtain what the law requires, Roland." He did not press his advantage with rhetoric. He held it as someone who owns a ledger. Gerald stepped back from the gallery with his linen bundle pressed under his arm. He could have spoken then, could have shouted that the record existed, and that the magistrate's motives were compromised. Instead, he walked down into the dim and placed the ledger in a small wooden box. He did this while the magistrate's back was turned, and the motion became the chapter's mini cliffhanger. Havel jammed a wedge into the chair's lock and the mechanism moved. A hidden cam flange forced spikes that had been set to pierce through padded leather to shift. The survivor flinched as metal touched the soft skin of his seat. Leather creaked, straps bit, and the craftsman turned another screw to test the trap. The room's noise tightened into a single, sustained mechanical rasp. The survivor started to scream, half a sound, not yet a full sentence, then stopped as the straps bit. The narrator registered the act. The device performed exactly as designed. Blood followed soon after, a clean and terrible line across linen. The sensation of hot iron and the strangled intake of breath moved the room like a wave. 3 things happened quickly. Brune stepped back and clapped his hands over his mouth. Havel's arm trembled. Roland kept his face as still as a carved hinge, but his knuckles whitened on the key. Gerald, standing near the archive door, let the wooden box slide from his hands, and it landed with a dull thud under a table. The sound was swallowed under the survivor's ragged air. "Stop, Brune." It was not a plea. It was a refusal. He dropped his hands from the mechanism and looked at Havel. "I will not finish this. I will not make another turn." The declaration split the room into immediate factions. Havel hesitated, rope creaking. "Brune, you would defy the magistrate," he said. "I will not place my name on a thing that tears a man for reasons I do not believe in," Brune replied. Roland's response was a narrow, cold strike. "Then you will step aside, Brune." Havel, finish this." Havel looked from Roland to Brune, and then at the survivor, whose breath came shallow and quick. He raised a hand as if to strike a balance between duty and conscience. The pause was a small decision that changed the course of the night. Havel lowered his hand and moved to turn the lock. But the lock would not move. The key that Roland held would not turn in the mechanism. For a long, locked heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Gerald pushed himself into the open and, with hands that would not stop trembling, walked past Havel and dropped the ledger under the chair. The action was deliberate and public. He cleared his throat and said, "I have copied the contested log. It is recorded here." He forced Roland's eyes to the table where the box slid out. Roland lunged forward and snatched the box, his nails scraping the wood. He ripped it open and the pages fell out, some stained with ink and a small smear of rust where the pendant had brushed them. For a second the room smelled of iron and old glue. The magistrate's face lost its practiced calm and flickered. Someone in the back hissed a question. "Is that Kai Hanesmark?" The survivor looked up and found the courage to say a name. "Kane took my sister to the West Hall. Cahan's men dragged me to the East Courtyard." The line was short and hauled a witness into the space. It supplied the twist that changed the chamber's reading. The survivor's pendant tied not only to rumor but to specific abuse linked to a noble. Roland slammed the pages onto the table as if that could bury the connections. He shouted, "This is unverified! This is hearsay!" But his voice had lost its calm floor. Brune's hand shook and Havel's jaw clenched. The room moved into a new argument. "Gerald, the ledger is signed. The signatures are those of servants who will not lie for the good of a lord. They signed for fear and factual detail. Read them. You will see dates and names, and an entry that places Lord Cain in the West Hall with a retinue who beat the women." He the last sentence plainly, as if stating an inventory. Roland slapped the ledger closed and pushed it away. "You would see a lord fall on the testimony of a man who clutches a wooden trinket." His tone was scorn. Havel answered with short words, "I will follow the law, Roland. If the law commands, it commands. But if you command me to abuse my oath, I will not obey." The survivor's breathing tore with each movement. He tried to speak, but there was no breath to push words out. Blood dampened his tunic and pooled on the chair's leather. He felt his strength ebbing, and with it a small arc of despair. For a moment he considered silence, letting his death be the end. Then the pendant pressed against his ribs and something like stubbornness, sharp as a tack, pushed him to force one last assertion. He looked at Gerald and said, "Put it in the archive. Hide it where someone will find it when the magistrate is not present. I will not die nameless. If this ledger survives, it will name them." His voice broke, but the instruction was clear. Preserve the evidence. Gerald did not argue. He slipped the pages into his cloak and walked to the narrow archive alcove. He withdrew a thin ledger he had kept hidden for such nights and tucked the contested pages into its binding. He pressed the ledger closed, wrapped it in oilcloth, and slid it into a hollow in the archive where only men who had worked the records long enough would know to look. That concealed preservation was the quiet act that would save memory. While Gerald moved, the magistrate called for order and a quick decision. We will continue and record all proceedings. Anyone who obstructs the sentence will be charged." Roland's voice tried to regain authority, and in some small measure did. Havel stepped forward to finish the mechanism. Brune stepped to the edge and refused to touch the lever again. Havel's hand found the key, but his grip trembled. The last turn, the one that would lock the mechanism for another pass of pain, required a sure hand. He looked at the survivor, at the stains spreading across the leather, and at the magistrate whose face had gone as pale as old paper. Then Havel made a choice. He placed the key on the table and collapsed into a chair, head resting on both palms. One by one, the officials found small excuses to step back. Brune wiped his hands on his apron, Roland cleared his throat and turned to the jurists. And Gerald closed the archive stone and covered the ledger with a pot of iron filings so no one would notice its spine. The room divided into motions and gestures that amounted to a lateral retreat. Outside the chamber, pre-dawn pushed grey through the narrow arrow slit, and a single guttering candle burned down beside the empty chair. The survivor's breathing slowed and then stuttered down to a shallow thread. His eyes opened once more and found Gerald at the archive doorway. He attempted to form a smile that was only a fraction of a line. "Gerald," he said, naming the scribe again, "promise me, keep it safe. Put it where the ledger will wait until someone with a key chooses honesty over favor." He coughed, a dry sound. Gerald bent and clasped the survivor's wrist. His knuckles left a dark imprint on the man's skin. "I will," he said in a voice that had lost the tremor and steadied into a vow. "I will hide this and return it to the ledger of truth when a judge will hear it without fear of favor." The survivor's eyes closed. Outside, Havel moved to the threshold and did not step back in. He lit a candle from the remaining flame and held it over the chair to mark the stain with a slow, quiet light. The narrator recorded the act with the same unemotional cadence used at the beginning. A scribe hid a ledger, a guard refused to finish a sentence, a craftsman would not make his hands carry the blame. When the chamber emptied, the chair remained in the center, its leather dark with the survivor's blood. The single candle guttered and left wax around a dropped rosary. Gerald placed the ledger into its hollow and closed the archive stone. He set the rosary beside the ledger as a quiet sign of the record's guard. Then he closed the iron trapdoor and left the key under a loose flagstone, where only he knew to look. The narrator ended the recording of the night by noting what the ledger would be when future eyes found it. A cold list of names, dates, and actions that would contradict the formal sentence, but might not overturn it. The final fact the narrator recorded was not a moral pronouncement, but a procedural one. The ledger existed. The last paragraph closed on a simple, concrete beat. Gerald pushed the archive stone into place, slid the wooden box under the table, and walked out of the antechamber with the hidden ledger pressed to his chest. A slow, deliberate step toward a morning where evidence would wait for a time when courage matched the record's need.